As someone who wears vintage every day and posts about it on social media, in my comment section, I hear this a lot, that people used to dress better, that everyday outfits looked more elegant, more put together. And I'll be honest, I kind of get why people think that. When we look at photographs from the past, even ordinary people, they often appear polished in a way that feels very different from how we dress day to day now. Even knowing the history, even knowing how demanding everyday life actually was, it's easy to feel like something has been lost. In the past, even everyday clothing felt more structured, more intentional, more elegant. But instead of treating that feeling as a fact, I have been trying to understand where that comes from, especially when it comes to fashion. So this video isn't about correcting that reaction. It's about getting curious about it. Why does the past look more elegant to us, especially when it comes to clothing and everyday dress? And what are we really responding to when we say that? I honestly think part of this has absolutely nothing to do with the past and everything to do with how modern life feels. Life now feels fast, it's loud, it's visually noisy. We're constantly asked to decide, optimize, improve, consume, and react. Even things that are meant to be comforting, like fashion or self-care, can start to feel like another performance. So when life feels overwhelming, it makes sense that we imagine another time as simpler. Not necessarily easier, but clearer. Fewer choices, stronger routines, more visible structure. I find myself wondering if what we're longing for just isn't really the past at all, but relief from constant friction. And I don't think that longing is wrong or naive. I think it's a very human response to feeling overstimulated and under-rested. One thing that I want to gently push back on, including with myself, is this idea that elegance comes from ease, that people were elegant because life was gentler. I don't think that's actually true. Getting dressed with care, maintaining routines, presenting yourself thoughtfully, those things can be grounding when life feels unstable. So elegance in that sense isn't about luxury. It's about self-respect, ritual, and care. And that's the version of elegance that I feel most drawn to. At the same time, and this absolutely matters, that mindset did not exist in a vacuum. Elegance wasn't just personal, it was social. How you dressed, groomed yourself, and carried yourself often had real consequences. It signaled respectability, morality, class, even employability. Keeping up appearances wasn't just aesthetic. It could be survival. And that's where I think that we have to be careful not to romanticize. Because for many people, elegance wasn't optional. It was enforced. And failing to meet those expectations could mean judgment, exclusion, or worse. So when we admire the polish of the past, it's important to ask who benefited from those rules, who was punished by them, and who never had access to elegance in the first place. Acknowledging that doesn't erase the beauty, it gives it context. I think this is really where so much of our perception comes from, the images that we've inherited from the past. For a long time, photography wasn't casual, it wasn't instant. It wasn't something you just did on a whim. It required planning, money, time, and intention. Early photographs needed long exposure times. People had to sit still. They dressed carefully. They posed deliberately. You didn't take 10 photos and keep one. You took one and you hoped it was good. And because photographs were expensive to produce and develop, they were often taken for a reason. A wedding, a milestone, something worth remembering. So right away, we're not even looking at everyday life in its entirety. We're looking at moments that people felt were meaningful enough to preserve. And in many ways, it's not so different for how we treat images now. We might have the technology to take photos constantly, but we still curate what we share. We post the good days, the outfits that worked, the moments where we felt put together. We don't usually document the laundry days, the exhaustion, the outfits that didn't come out, or the mornings where just nothing felt right. So when we look at images from the past, especially the ones that circulate most widely, like magazine spreads, film stills, promotional photographs, or formal portraits, we're often looking at a highlight reel of an era. And because those images are often beautifully styled, well lit, and intentional, they become our reference point for what normal looked like. Most people aren't forming their mental picture from the past from candid snapshots or workwear catalogs. They're forming it from films, fashion magazines, advertisements, and carefully posed photographs, all of which were designed to present an ideal. Elegance in those contexts wasn't accidental. It was aspirational. It was meant to be seen, and that aspiration mattered, not just for wealthy people, but across classes. Being photographed well, being presentable, being remembered with dignity, those were powerful motivations. So of course people dressed for the camera. Of course those images look polished. What we don't see nearly as often are the unphotographed hours, the repetition, the mess, the clothes worn for practicality rather than presentation. Those moments didn't feel photographable. They weren't meant to be preserved, and over time, that absence shapes our memory just as much as what did survive. I'm very aware of this in my own life. I get comments all the time about how my hair's always perfect or I'm always put together, and that just simply is not true. I have off days. I have bad hair days. I have days where just nothing quite works. I just don't document them. So when I think about how the past looks to us now, it makes sense that it feels more elegant. We're not seeing the full picture. We're not seeing the moments people chose to leave behind. And that doesn't make those images false, but it does mean that they're incomplete. And once you start noticing that absence, it kind of changes how you look at the past. Because of this, something I often encourage newcomers to the vintage world, especially when it comes to style and hair, is to look for inspiration more in regular photographs from people of the past, not necessarily fashion editorials, not movie stills, not promotional images. I mean everyday photographs, family snapshots, street photos, informal portraits. That's where you start to see what life actually looked like. You see hairstyles that aren't perfect. You see frizz. You see styles that have softened over the course of the day. You see women clearly trying their best to recreate what they've seen in magazines or on movie screens with the tools, skills, and time that they had. And I love that because those images don't take anything away from the beauty of the past. They humanize it. They remind us that most people weren't living inside a fashion plate. They were adapting trends to real bodies, real hair, and real lives. I talk about this a lot in my style sessions and in my hair group because when people only use the most polished images as inspiration, it's very easy to feel like you're failing or that you've done something wrong, when in reality, you're just living in the part of the day that never made it into the photograph. Those everyday images show effort, not perfection. And to me, that feels so much closer to the truth. Another reason that the past can feel more elegant is that people owned fewer clothes and cared for them differently. Garments were often more durable, more expensive relative to income, and expected to last. That encouraged mending, maintenance, and attention. And there's something appealing about that, especially in contrast to modern disposability. But again, there is a flip side. Having fewer clothes also meant fewer options. Wearing things past their comfort and sometimes adapting your body to garments, not the other way around. So while there was care, there was also constraint. Both can be true at the same time. When we talk about comfort in modern life in relation to fashion, it's usually framed as something purely physical, softness, stretch, and ease. But for me, comfort isn't just about how something feels on my skin. It's also about how I feel in myself when I'm wearing it. I was reminded of this by a comment I got recently on a video where I was sharing a cozy winter outfit, a wool skirt, knee-high socks, a turtleneck, and a cardigan. And someone commented, "It looks beautiful, but is it really cozy? I feel cozy in my pajamas." And I've heard versions of that sentiment many times. The idea that comfort automatically means leggings or jeans and a t-shirt or loungewear. But comfort is subjective. I'm personally not comfortable in leggings or jeans, and especially loungewear worn outside the house. I feel far more comfortable physically and mentally when my outfit feels complete, when it's intentional, layered, appropriate for where I'm going. My body relaxes, I feel grounded, I move differently. So when I say something feels cozy, I don't just mean warm. I mean settled, prepared, put together in a way that lets you move through the world comfortably. And that's not a judgment about what anyone else wears. It's about recognizing that comfort isn't universal. It's emotional as well as physical, shaped by our bodies, our sensory needs, our experiences, and even our cultural expectations. I think we sometimes treat modern casual dress as the ultimate expression of freedom without asking whether it actually works for everyone. In the past, expectations were more rigid and often unfair. Today we have more choice, but that also means that we have to define comfort for ourselves instead of assuming there's one right answer. So for me, choosing vintage or vintage-inspired clothing isn't about rejecting comfort. It's about choosing a version of it that includes care, structure, and a sense of completion without obligation. And I think that's a meaningful shift from the past. Elegance no longer has to be enforced. It can be chosen. This is where it gets personal for me. Wearing vintage today is a choice, a non-conforming one in many spaces. What's interesting though is that something that was once the norm now reads as alternative, even a little defiant. And I think that's part of why it feels meaningful. I'm not dressing this way because I have to. I'm not meeting a social requirement. I'm choosing ritual, care, and presentation without obligation. And I'm constantly figuring out what that means. What parts of elegance feel nourishing rather than restrictive? What routines feel grounding rather than demanding? And what's worth keeping and what belongs in the past? One thing that I think is really important to talk about here is why people in the past, including working class people, just often looked more dressed up to our modern eyes, even in everyday situations. And I don't think it's because everyone was just elegant all the time. I think it's because we're working with a completely different baseline for what it means to be dressed. For much of the late 19th and early 20th century, being dressed was the default state. Clothing had structure by default, even when it was practical, even when it was worn for work. Women commonly wore house dresses, which today would sound like loungewear, but really weren't. They were work clothes. They were meant for cooking, cleaning, childcare, but they were still buttoned, shaped, detailed, and intentionally worn garments. They weren't pajamas. They were what you put on to do the work of the day. And for men, button-up shirts and trousers weren't just for formal wear. They were basic daily clothing. That's what you wore to work, to run errands, to exist outside the house. What reads as smart or polished to us now was simply normal So when we look back, our eyes read structure as effort. But at the time, it wasn't about effort. It was about function and expectation. I think another piece of this is that clothing categories were much more clearly defined. Certain garments were worn for specific purposes. You had work clothes, house clothes, leisure clothes, and formal clothes, and they didn't overlap very much. Athletic wear, for example, was worn for athletics. Leisure clothes were worn for leisure. There wasn't really a concept of wearing exercise clothing as everyday public dress because those garments didn't exist in the same way, and the social meaning of clothing was very different. Over time, especially in the late 20th century, those lines started to blur. Clothing became more flexible, more casual, and more adaptable across settings. And that brought freedom and comfort, but it also shifted our visual expectations. So when we look at historical images now, even ordinary people can appear dressed up simply because their everyday clothes have shape, layers, and intention built into them. It doesn't mean that they were more elegant as people, it just means that we have redefined casual. And I think that's an important distinction because when we say people were more elegant back then, what we may actually be noticing is that everyday clothing used to signal readiness, being prepared to meet the world, in a way that modern casual dress often does not prioritize. And that's not necessarily a criticism of modern clothing. It's just a recognition that our visual language has changed. I don't want to love the past by flattening it. I don't want to wash over the inequities, the pressures, or the harm, even as I appreciate the beauty and intention that existed alongside them. Understanding history fully, the good and the bad, is how we honor how we got here. It lets us choose thoughtfully instead of copying blindly. So where does this leave me? I still love vintage elegance, especially when I think about it in context and when it's something that I can engage with by choice, not by expectation. For me, it's less about recreating the past and more about understanding it and about seeing how people used clothing, routine, and presentation to move through lives that were often demanding and complicated. I'm still learning, still questioning, still figuring out how to carry the parts that feel meaningful into modern life where the old rules just no longer apply. So I'll leave you with a few questions that I'm still sitting with myself. What does elegance mean to you when it's something that you choose, not something that is expected of you? Which elements of historical dress or daily routine feel supportive or grounding to you now, and which ones don't fit your life today? And how can we bring more intention into how we dress and live without pretending that the past was perfect or uncomplicated? I don't think there's one right answer. I just think these are good questions to start a conversation. I hope this gave you something to think about, and I would really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you next time. Bye.